Our Torah portion this week is called Ekev, which can be translated as a result or because. And it covers Deuteronomy chapter 7, 12 through 11 and 25. And we get the title for this. Passage from the first verse, which says, "Then it shall come about because you listen to these judgments and do them." That's the NAS translation, or the ESV starts off, "and because you listen to these rules." And so this is where we get the title. This is a long passage. It spans about 5 chapters. So before we dig in, let's get into the context of where we are at in the book of Deuteronomy. The last time we were in Deuteronomy a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that in this book, Moses addresses the people of Israel 3 times. So when we were in Numbers, remember they had come to the last stop, the last place before they went into the land. Now Moses is going to talk to the people before they go into the land. The book of Deuteronomy takes place over a few weeks, maybe a month. And so Moses gives 3 discourses or 3 speeches to the people. The first one goes from chapter 1 and chapter 1 to chapter 4 and verse 43. The second address goes from chapter 4 and 44 to chapter 28 and verse 68. And then the third address goes from 29:1 through 30 and verse 20 to the end of the chapter. So the third address is the shortest. It's only 2 chapters long. And in this passage, Israel renews their covenant with God. And then Moses' ministry comes to an end, right? Moses dies, and then he hands off his mantle to Joshua. In the first address, it's 5 chapters long, and it's just a brief overview of Israel's history from Mount Sinai to Horeb, or Horeb is the name of Mount Sinai in Deuteronomy, like we talked about, up into the current location of where we're at. So it's just a brief overview, introduction into the book. So this second address, the one that we're in, this is the longest address, spanning 24 chapters. So therefore, this address covers the majority of the book of Deuteronomy. And in this second address, Moses begins with an introduction to the Torah. That's from chapters 4, 44, and through verse 49. And then he reiterates the 10 commandments, which is chapter 5 and verse 1 through chapter 21. And then from chapter 6 to chapter 26, Moses restates of much of the Torah, much of what was already given by God. And again, this is the reason why the title of the book means the second law or the repeated law. In the Greek, Deuteronomy is taken from a Greek word. So here Moses reiterates the religious and national regulations as well as the regulations for domestic and personal relationships. That's what he covers in these 20 chapters, so 24 chapters. So according to one commentary, in these chapters, after Moses lists the 10 commandments, he then elaborates on each of the 10 commandments. In other words, in all of these chapters, they can be divided up into each of the 10 commandments. That's how they can be organized. You can look at the 10 commandments as an outline, and then all of these other chapters kind of fit in there. So the truth is, though, there's many ways that we can divide up all the books of the Bible. If you've ever looked through different commentaries, you can see that different people divide up the chapters different ways. There's different outlines based on themes, based on topics, and that sort of thing. But I kind of like this idea that Moses has taken each of the 10 commandments and kind of categorizing them, or at least this outline anyway. So that's kind of what I'm going to go through today. But this first passage, the passage that we're in, it covers all of the first commandment. So let's talk about that here for a second. Let's look at the first commandment. Now, this is where this 10 commandment outline idea kind of breaks down. In case you didn't know, there's 3 versions of the 10 commandments. I found this out when I came into the Torah movement, Messianic movement, when I came out of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has a different version. The Catholic and the Lutherans have one version of the 10 commandments. Judaism has another version of the 10 commandments, and the Protestants have another version of the 10 commandments. And where it differs is the first commandment and then the last couple of commandments. So we'll just talk about the first commandment. In the Jewish version, verse 6 is the first commandment. And verse 6 basically says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. So in Judaism, that's the first commandment. In the Roman Catholic version, verse 6 and verse 7 are the first commandment. So I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, and you shall have no other gods besides me. And the Protestant version, verse 7 is the first commandment. You shall have no other gods besides me. So that's how they differ in the first commandment. And then in the last commandment, the Jewish version and the Protestant version are the same. They add the coveting together, but in the Catholic version, they separate coveting things and coveting wives differently. So those are the basic differences between the three versions of the Ten Commandments. So it's interesting that how can in the Jewish version that first commandment, how can that verse 6 be a commandment? I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's to them, it's a commandment. Well, the Bible doesn't call these 10 commandments. That's a man-made tradition to call these 10 commandments. In Judaism, they're known as the 10 words. Okay, they're 10 words or 10 declarations. They're not necessarily commandments. They don't see them all as commands. But we do understand that they're like an outline to all of the Torah. All of the commandments we find in the Torah can fit underneath them. So what I'm going to be talking about is the Protestant version, verse 7 being the first commandment, which says, you shall have no other gods before me. Okay? So in order to do that, I know our Torah portion starts in verse 7, but we're going to start in chapter 7, but we're going to start in chapter 6 so we can get the whole context of this, because the idea is that he just said the 10 commandments again in chapter 5, and now he's going to reiterate them, starting with the first commandment. Okay, chapter 6, verse 1. Now this is the commandment, the statutes, and the judgments which the Lord your God has commanded me to teach you, that you might do them in the land where you are going over to possess it, so that you and your son and your grandson might fear the Lord your God, to keep all his statutes and his commandments, which I command you today, all the days of your life, so that your days may be prolonged. O Israel, you should listen and be careful to do it, that it may be well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, just as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you in a land flowing with milk and honey. Okay, are the verses that come right before the Shema, which we read earlier today. The Shema. And here is what the Shema says. The first two verses. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So this first section that we're going to go through is about loving God. Okay? He is the one God. He is our one God, and we are commanded to love our God. This is where I get the title, You Shall Love the Lord Your God. So we will see that this phrase is used as bookends to the passage that we're going through. The first thing we come out with is love your God, and we're going to end with you shall love your God. And this is because if we have no other gods except the Lord, if he is our God, it is him who we only serve, and therefore it should be him that we only love. Now, we've talked about this before, but according to Scripture, love is not a feeling, but rather an act of the will. Okay, it's not just a warm, fuzzy feeling that we have inside towards God. It's an act. It's something that we do. We demonstrate our love by the actions that we do. So we choose to act in a loving way despite our feelings. Okay, you have to love. The Bible commands husbands, love your wives. Okay, well, if a husband married the woman, if a man married a woman, obviously he didn't dislike her. He must have had some feelings for her. So in our way of understanding marriage or love that's important to have when you get married. It's good to love the person. But also it needs to be demonstrated in acts. It needs to be demonstrated in the way that we live. Let's continue in verse 6. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets on your forehead. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So the command here given to us by God, this is how we are supposed to love God. It says, the passage before says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And now this is how you're supposed to do that. By thinking of them all the time. God's words are supposed to be on our mind all the time. It says they shall be on your heart. We've talked about before that the heart in Jewish thought is the seat of the intellect. So we're supposed to have the words of God on our mind all the time, thinking about the words of God all the time. It says, you shall teach them diligently to your children. So if they're on our mind all the time and we have our children with us, we should be speaking of them, teaching them to our children all the time. It says, you shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way, when you lie down and when you rise up. In other words, talking about them all the time. The words of God should be on our mind all the time. Now, it doesn't mean that we can't talk about a song we just heard, or, I don't know, a car we just saw, or a dog that's just walked by us in the park, or whatever it is. It doesn't mean we can't talk about other things. But we can bring up these things in the course of that. Especially if you're listening to music or watching movies or reading books. We can apply those things to the Word or match them up to the Word. Do they match to the Word? Weigh them against the Word of God. It says, bind them as a sign. Okay, well, is this literal? This is one passage that I didn't get a chance to, I didn't really focus in on this too much, but my understanding is this is taken literally, and this is when we put the tefillin on our hands and on our head, and it's time for us to pray. But also we understand that this sign on our head and on our hand, it's a picture of what is in our mind. The thoughts in our mind come out in the actions that we do by our hand. But also it says, you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. It's talking about the mezuzah. We put the tradition is to put the words of God on the doorways of our homes, on the gates of the city. And why do we do that? As a reminder, to remind us as we're going in, as we're coming out. In other words, what this is saying, all these verses, what it's saying is that the Word of God should be encompassed in all of our life, in every aspect of our life. If we love the Lord our God, because He is the only God, then we are going to do all of these things. We're going to have His words in and through our lives all the time. Jump down to verse 13. You shall fear only the Lord your God, and you shall worship Him and swear by His name. You shall not follow other gods, any of the gods of the people around you. For the Lord your God in the midst of you is a jealous God. Otherwise, the anger of the Lord your God will be kindled against you, and He will wipe you off the face of the earth. So the Lord is saying, when you love Him, you've come into covenant with Him. And when you come into covenant with Him, you cannot be in covenant with other gods. You can only follow Him. You can't follow these other gods who really aren't gods. They're demons, false religions. But we can't put our faith in those things because we're putting our faith in our God. And He's a jealous God. And He's not going to allow us to bring things that belong to these other gods to Him, or to worship other gods in the way that they want to be worshiped. He's a jealous God. And it says here, the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you if you do, and He will wipe you off the face of the earth. We'll get back to that in a minute. So this whole first passage, this whole chapter 6, is talking about loving God. Now let's go to the next chapter, chapter 7. We're just going to skip over these because, again, there's 5 chapters for us to go through, and it's hard to get through the 1-year Torah portion in an expositional way in which we're going through every verse. So we'll talk about an idea that we have once this Torah portion concludes after Shemoneh Atzeret, after the 8th day of assembly later on this year. So chapter 7. The theme of chapter 7 is to follow God rather than follow the nations. The end of verse 2 says, you shall make no... Okay, let's go to verse 2. And when the Lord your God delivers them before you, talking about all the nations that are in the land when they go into the land and take over, when the Lord your God delivers them before you and you defeat them, then you shall utterly destroy them. Make no covenant with them and show no favor to them. You can't make a covenant with these people because you've made a covenant with God. To make a covenant with these people means you're going to go into covenant with their gods as well. Verse 3, furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons. For they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and he will quickly destroy you. Yeshua says we're not to be unequally yoked. What that means is believers need to marry other believers. It's difficult, especially for us who are Messianic or Torah observant, however you want to call yourself, knowing that we observe the Torah in the way that we do. We worship on Saturday. We follow the biblical festivals. We don't follow the other traditions. It's tough enough for children in our camp to find someone to marry because we're a remnant. We're not a very big group of people. And I've seen people who have married across the faith, or they'll marry someone who still keeps, let's say, Christmas, which can be a very hot topic with families, and it can be a point of great contention in some families. I've known some people who, because most of us have come out of the Christian camp, we've come out of traditional Christianity or Catholicism, and in order to just get away from the familial strife of those holidays, I've known people who have just left town so they wouldn't have to get involved in all of the strife and the arguments that happen, because why aren't you celebrating the things that we're celebrating? So we have it hard enough in our camp of believers. But if you go outside the believing camp and you marry outside an unbeliever, imagine how much more trouble is going to be brought into marriages in that kind of situation. How much baggage and how much idolatry and worldliness is going to be brought into the family. And so this is why, as parents, it's our responsibility to try and help our children, to do what we can to help our children find a believer, another believer to marry, another believer to get to know in order to marry. Because like what's happening here, they're about to go into this land, and back in these days, the countries had their own gods. Each nation, they had their own gods that they worshiped. So when you join that nation, you're joining that religion as well. And also he's saying, even if the daughters come in, they're going to bring that into the households. Those daughters weren't necessarily taught to accept the household of the husbands. They're going to try and bring that in. And we saw that with the Moabites and what happened with all that. So God is saying in verse 6, for you are a holy people to the Lord your God. He has set apart his people to follow him. And he's given them a way to live. He's given them a way to worship and how to be his followers, his chosen people. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his own possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. So he has set them apart to be his people. He's saying, follow me, don't follow the nations. Here's why, because they're going to lead you away from me. Verse 12. Then it shall come about, this is the beginning of our Torah portion. Then it shall come about, because you listen to these judgments and keep and do them, that the Lord your God will keep you with his covenant and his loving kindness, which he swore to your fathers. He will love you and bless you and multiply you. He's telling them, you go into the land, follow me. And I'm going to love you. I'm going to keep the covenant. I'm going to keep my side of the covenant that I said I would by blessing you and multiplying you. That's part of the Abrahamic covenant. That's part of this, all the promise that God has promised in the people, that he's telling them. I'm going to multiply you. So what? You can't count your numbers. They're going to be like the stars in the sky, like the sand on the sea. So they have to follow him and not the other nations. Okay, let's go to chapter 8. Chapter 8, the overall theme, or one of the themes that we can find in this, is not to forget the Lord your God. Don't forget God. Verse 2, you shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So God was the one that brought them in there. God was doing this for a purpose. Verse 3, he humbled you and let you be hungry and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. So when you're in these tough situations, you need to know that maybe you put yourselves there and you are facing the consequences of your actions. But also, God has you there for a reason. God is trying to teach you something. And so we can't forget him. We can't forget he's the one that may have put us here. What is it that you need to know? What is it that you need to learn from? Verse 11, beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his ordinances and his statutes, which I am commanding you today. So by not keeping the commandments, you're forgetting the Lord. You're not like, oh, I forgot he existed. No, this is more covenantal language, that you are breaking the covenant. If you're forgetting him, you're forgetting your love to him, you're forgetting the covenants that you've made with him. You're breaking the covenant. Verse 18, but you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who has given you power to make wealth, that he may confirm his covenant, which he swore to your fathers. So when you come into the land, you become prosperous, you have all this food, you have cities, and you're doing really well. He's saying, don't forget, you didn't do this. I did this for you. So that's another one of the ways that we can forget God when we become successful. We think, wow, look at all my talents, or wow, look at the way that I'm able to manage my finances or my company or whatever. And you think, well, you start patting yourself on the back, but it's God that did that. So we can't forget the Lord in our success. Chapter 9, do not boast in your own righteousness. That's the overall theme of this chapter, not to boast in your own righteousness. Verse 4 of chapter 9. Do not say in your heart, when the Lord your God has driven all these people out of the land, when he has driven them out before you, because of my righteousness the Lord has brought me into to possess this land. Because it is because of the wickedness of the nations that the Lord is dispossessing them before you. So it wasn't because how good Israel was. It wasn't because there were these great righteous people. I mean, look, they were in the wilderness for 40 years because of their sin, because of their disbelief, their disobedience, and their lack of faith. So it wasn't because of them. Verse 6, know then, it is not because of your righteousness that the Lord your God has given you this good land to possess, for you are a stubborn people. I like that, because he's saying it's not because of your righteousness, you're stubborn. You're a stubborn group of people. I didn't do this for you. And then Moses goes on and just lists all the things that they did while they were in the wilderness. Yeah, that's a pretty hard chapter to go through, because he's reminding them, yeah, this is what you did. Okay, so don't look on your own righteousness. Now let's jump to the next section, chapter 10 and verse 12. This next section is fearing the Lord. We need to learn to fear the Lord. Verse 12, now Israel, what does the Lord your God require from you but to fear the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to love him, and to serve your Lord with all your heart and with all your soul? So what does it mean to fear him? Well, to walk in his ways. If we fear the Lord, we're going to walk in his ways. We're going to serve him with all of our heart, with all of our life. Verse 20, You shall fear the Lord your God. That's a command. You shall fear the Lord your God. You shall serve him and cling to him. You shall swear by his name. He is your praise, and he is your God, who has done great things and awesome things for which you have seen with your eyes. So because of the great things that you've seen God do, we should fear him. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute when I wrap up. Chapter 11, the last chapter, the overall theme is keeping the commands of the Lord. This is what we read today. You shall therefore love the Lord your God and always keep his charge, his statutes, his ordinances, and his commands. So if you love the Lord, you will keep his charge, you will keep his statutes, you will keep his ordinances, you will keep his commands. Each of these things are different. I thought I put down what each of these things were, but they're all a different word. They all mean different things. A charge is like I don't know. I was helping someone with their wedding, and I said, in this part, I think it was my niece back in Texas, and I said, I'm going to have like a charge for you and your husband. She's like, what is a charge? Well, it's like you're getting married, and so this is what is expected of you as a wife or as a husband. You know, it's not a word that we normally use, but we give a charge to someone who is who goes through a rite of passage, like a bar mitzvah or something. This is your charge into adulthood. You know, it's just something that you're required in the position that you're at. The statutes are the laws of God's, the laws of God. There's another word, I think just law is just another word that's used as statutes. And then ordinances, I can't think of an example of an ordinance. And then the commands are just God's, speaking commands to the people to do. But anyway, these are all 4 different things. And actually, you could add laws in there. There'd be 5 different things. It would be good for us to get an understanding of this. I mean, this is really similar of what God told Isaac concerning Abraham way back in Genesis, Genesis 26. He tells Isaac, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands, and by your descendants all the nations of the earth will be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, kept my commands, kept my statutes, and kept my laws. So Abraham did these things. Wait a minute. How did Abraham do all these things when the Torah is given through Moses? That's probably another conversation we can have later. But because Abraham was obedient, God blessed him. God was going to use him. And therefore, he's going to use Isaac. And therefore, he's going to use Isaac's sons, and on and on. Verse 8 of chapter 11. You shall therefore keep every commandment which I am commanding you to do today. So God is commanding the people to do the commands. That's kind of interesting, huh? Being commanded to keep commands. You're commanded to obey the commands. Now, I'll wrap it up with just a kind of a quick summary of what we just went through. So the idea here is all these chapters, they fall under the overall command of to have no other gods but the Lord. So the first section, to love the Lord your God. If you love the Lord, you'll obey his commandments. Okay? And we obey his commandments because we have no other gods but him. Okay, there's no other gods but him, so we obey his commandments. The second section was to follow the Lord rather than to follow the nations. Why? Because the nations are going to lead you away from God. The nations are going to lead you to other gods. And we follow the Lord because there are no other gods but him. The third section was not to forget the Lord your God. Whatever our situation is, we know that it was God who put us in that situation, and we were successful. We know that it was God that brought us success. All the glory should go to him. And when we're being humbled or we're being disciplined, we need to know that it's God who's doing that discipline for us because he loves us. A father will discipline his son because he loves him. And so we know that it's God. We don't forget our God because he's the only God. We have no other gods but him. The fourth section, we're not to boast on our own righteousness because we remember that it wasn't because of our righteousness that God has chosen us. He says in verse 24, you have been rebellious against the Lord from the day I knew you. So it is the same with us. It was like that with Israel, so it is the same with us. None of us are perfect. And it's because of the wickedness of the nations that he chose Israel. And for us, it's only through the righteousness of Yeshua that we're able to come into the presence of the Lord. No other God can do this, and there's no other God but the Lord. The fifth section was to fear the Lord your God. Now, sure, this can mean a reverent fear, that we fear the Lord, meaning we respect the Lord, that we respect who he is. We have this reverent fear of him, but it also means that we need to understand who God is and what he can do to us. Imagine seeing all the miracles that happened when they came out of Egypt. If God can do that, what can he do to me? And even Yeshua tells us, do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul. Fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. So we need to have this fear of the Lord, knowing this fear and this awe of him, knowing of what he can do, not just to our bodies, but to our soul for eternity. So we fear him because there are no other gods but him. And finally, the last section was we keep the commands of the Lord. And why do we keep the commands of the Lord? Because we love him. We do these things because we love him. We want to serve him. We want to do what he has told us, because it's not only is it good for us, it honors him. And this brings us all full circle to the first section of what I talked about. We obey the Lord because we love him. And we love him because we have no other gods but him.